In this video, we're going to discuss Actifio Multi Target OnVault and how it compares to the Geo-Redundancy options made available by various cloud providers. In today's multi-cloud environment, many organizations are moving production into a cloud provider's region. However, the 3-2-1 backup strategy that says we should always have at least 3 backups on 2 different mediums with 1 copy off-site still very much applies. So if my production environment is the Sydney region of AWS or Azure or GCP, then my DR, my off-site site may well be Singapore or Melbourne. Now, in this case, what it means is that I need to, if I'm running production in Sydney and I need to get my backup off-site, I need to choose an alternate region in which to host that. So how do I get the data there? Now, before we talk about geo-redundancy, it's important to explain that there is this concept already of the availability zone. So when a cloud provider sets up in a region, so for instance, AWS or Azure or GCP setting up into Sydney, they obviously expose to the end user what we call an endpoint, if we're talking about object storage, which is the target that we use to write into that region. However, in the back end, they will generally build or occupy at least 3 data centers, and each data center in that region is known as an availability zone. Most providers usually have 3, though there are some examples, some exceptions. AWS Tokyo has 4, AWS Osaka, when I recorded this video, only had 1. Now, what it means is you write to an endpoint, and in the back end, the cloud provider writes 3 copies into 3 different availability zones, so that if one of those availability zones goes offline, the data is still available, in fact, still highly available. Now, just as an aside, some vendors do offer the option to write all 3 copies into a single availability zone, and you do get a price benefit from that, but obviously you have an availability price as well. So that's availability within a region. But remember, what we want to talk about is availability across regions. Now, the first thing to think about is that when you select the location for an object storage bucket, in general, you choose a region for this bucket to be created. So in this case, I'm building my bucket in Amazon. I'm calling it bottomless bucket in the cloud. I'm creating it in the Asia Pacific Sydney region in AWS. And in fact, in this case, the endpoint includes the region where I started my bucket, AP Southeast 2, which is the Sydney region. However, more recently, I've noticed that a lot of cloud providers are no longer including the region in the endpoint. So if I go and look at GCP, again, I've chosen my region for my bucket, and my region is going to be Australia Southeast 1, which is Sydney. But in fact, the URL that was created for that endpoint doesn't actually mention that. And the reason is that at creation time, I can choose to make a single region, or I can in fact ask GCP to make my offsite copy my multi-region copy in multiple locations, and there are choices here that I can select to do that. So if I go with geo-redundancy from a cloud provider's perspective, then generally what happens is that I write the data into the first region, and then the cloud provider asynchronously writes it into a second region for me. So, as if we showed for my travel photos, we hit the Sydney region, and then my offsite copy, that 3-2-1, the 1, is going to be copied by the cloud provider asynchronously into the second region for me. And most of the cloud providers offer this, obviously. I think they all do. AWS calls it cross-region replication, CRR. Azure calls it geo-redundant storage, GRS. They have 2 different sorts, depending on whether you want to use the local redundancy or the zone redundancy. Remember, I talked about those 3 availability zones. Now, I'm mentioning Dell EMC Data Domain here, which you go, well, hang on, that's not a cloud provider. But in fact, from an Actifio perspective, that region 1 could actually be a data domain in a data center, and this region 2 could be a data domain in a second data center. And we could be using EMC Data Domain Replicator to replicate between the 2. So the end result from a business perspective is exactly the same. And as we've talked about, GCP have dual region and multi-region options. So that's obviously choice number 1. I can get my cloud provider to create my offsite copy where I'm putting backups in region 1 and getting the cloud provider to replicate them into region 2 to give me my offsite. Great. How can I do this with Actifio? Well, the answer is we have this concept called OnVault, where we take an image, we store it locally in our snapshot pool, and then we push it out into an object storage bucket. Now, you might think, okay, I've already got my two mediums here, because if I've got a snapshot pool copy and an object storage copy, that's two mediums. And if I put the object storage in a different region, I've got my offsite. But in general, what happens is, if this production data is in the Sydney region, my snapshot pool is in the Sydney region, people tend to want to put their first object storage backup into the object storage of the same region from a geolocation perspective. But obviously, if I wanted to have multiple copies in different regions, I can use this thing called multi-target OnVault. In this example, you can see I've actually set up 4 separate targets. What this means is that we're not going to write to one region, we're literally going to write to 4 different regions. So these could be different cloud providers, or this could be, as I said, AWS Sydney, AWS Singapore, and then AWS Tokyo, AWS Osaka, as my 4 different copies in 4 different regions. But the difference here is, rather than the cloud provider doing the replication, the Actifio appliance is running a separate job to each region to effectively achieve the same thing, to give me that geo-redundancy. Now, the nice thing, if I do it that way, is that if I'm, for instance, running my Actifio Sky appliance in the Sydney region, and I'm creating my backups in the Sydney region and my offsite copy in the Singapore region using that second OnVault job, using that multi-target OnVault capability, if I have an outage in the Sydney region that affects just the Sky, so for instance, the availability zone that the Sky is in is down, I could bring up a new Sky appliance in the Singapore region and then import the images from the Singapore bucket, or in fact even from the Sydney bucket, and start using them. The nice thing here is that the Sky appliance that created the images is not required to access the images. And in fact, I could bring up multiple Sky appliances, one to access the images in Singapore and another to access the images in Sydney. So I get phenomenal capability here from the perspective that I don't need to depend on the thing that made it to access it, and I can access each copy independently without doing anything about the relationship between the two. So I don't have to do a failover or anything. I can simply start up a Sky, import the images, and start using them. So this obviously leads to a question: shall I use the geo-redundancy features offered by my cloud provider, or shall I just use the Actifio multi-target OnVault? So first up, if we're in AWS, if you want to use the CRR capability, which is their version of geo-redundancy, you need to turn on versioning. And the way that the Actifio OnVault function works is that we don't want versioning, because it breaks expiration. So if we leave versioning turned off, it means we can't use CRR. Not a problem, we'll use Actifio multi-target OnVault instead. If we're using Azure with GRS, we actually hit an even more interesting problem, which is this whole thing of how do I access that secondary copy? Remember when I talked about the Actifio OnVault, where I had Sydney and Singapore, if I can access both the Sydney copy and the Singapore copy independently of each other. But with Azure, if I'm writing to 2 regions using their geo-redundancy, if I want to access the secondary copy, I actually have to do a failover if I want to make that secondary copy read write. So that is a bit of a pain, but particularly if I'm trying to do a DR test. So we're much better off here using multi-target OnVault and writing to the 2 separate regions, and then we can access each region independently. Now, again, I mentioned Data Domain earlier, and obviously if you're thinking, well, Data Domain is not a cloud provider, but in fact the same concept applies from an Actifio perspective, which is that I can write OnVault images to the first data domain and OnVault images to the second data domain independently, both using DD Boost, so you get the same efficiencies that you get from a data domain replication method, but I avoid the need to break replication when I want to do a DR test. So there's real benefit from a business perspective by writing separately to each target rather than letting the DD do the replication for us. Now, I'll bring up GCP replication because there's a couple of interesting questions here. If you use dual region within GCP, GCP chooses the regions for you. So from a compliance perspective, this can be a bit of an issue. Do I want them to use these 2 regions? If I'm in Australia, do I really want my data in Japan? And if I'm in Japan, do I really want my data in Australia, for instance? If I choose multi-region, then basically GCP will choose at least 2 regions within a geographical area. Again, if I'm in the US, that might be quite acceptable. But if I was in Asia Pacific, and I have a strict requirement to have my data in Australia, I might find that my data is in fact in 2 regions that are not Australia. Is that desirable? The other thing is that I don't have that ability to access the two regional copies separately if I use either of these choices. I will say that there is an attraction to using the multi-region capability rather than the dual region, which is that there is a price benefit. So, a little bit of a decision tree. If I'm using AWS and I want to have geo-redundancy, use multi-target OnVault to avoid versioning. If I'm in Azure, use multi-target OnVault to avoid the read access problem of trying to get to the secondary. The same with data domain. If I'm considering GCP dual region, use multi-target OnVault. You won't see any difference in cost, but you can choose the regions deliberately. And if I'm looking at multi-region, there is definitely a cost benefit over dual region because you're only paying for one copy, not two. But I might have a compliance problem and, as I said, a technical access problem. The other thing is, depending on your cloud vendor, often they use asynchronous replication. Well, in fact, they all do. Now, there is some option to do synchronous, but in the majority of cases, we want to do asynchronous replication. The issue there is that I write to the first region, know the data is in the first region, and then the cloud provider writes to the second region asynchronously. So they talk about data loss. So data loss is literally if the first region dies before data has been put into the second region, I don't have that data in the second region. In fact, the second region might not even be in a consistent state. Multi-target OnVault, the way it works is we create images, and only when the image is finished do we say, okay, it's now accessible. But we can make those images independently of each other. We can run two OnVault jobs simultaneously, one to Sydney, one to Singapore. When both jobs are done, you know, hand on heart, the data is there. This is genuinely a better alternative. All right. So hopefully that has answered some questions about whether I should use geo-redundancy or multi-target OnVault. Please send any questions to or leave a comment, and thank you very much for listening.